forth to help you shall return to Egypt into their own land. And the Chaldeans shall come again and fight against this city, and take it and burn it with fire. Thus saith the Lord, deceive not yourselves, saying, the Chaldeans shall surely depart from us, for they shall not depart. For though ye had smitten the whole army, and look at this, though ye had smitten the whole army of the Chaldeans that fight against you, and there remained but wounded men among them, yet should they rise up every man in his tent and burn this city with fire. That is not what the people wanted to hear. That was not the hopeful expectation that they had. Now that this army that had just sieged the city had left, Jeremiah said, hey guys, don't get your hopes up. The army's coming back, and they're going to burn this city with fire. That's kind of dousing some hope, isn't it? You guys ever know somebody that did that? You know, everybody's all excited, and they say, that's never going to work. You know, but this was God's word. It's not just he's a naysayer. He was saying what God had to say, and the people were unwilling to follow it. It's this reason in verses 8 through 10, Jeremiah reaffirms the Chaldeans will come back and destroy the city. Even if you were to defeat the Babylonian army, he says, and there were just wounded men left, they would rise up and destroy this city because it was God's word. We find encouragement and realize that God's word will always come true. God's word will always come true. He will not fail one promise that he has made in his word. And it's upon his word that we need to stake our claim. We need to hold to his word, whether it makes sense to us or not. We follow his word because his word will come to pass. The next section we see in verse 11 through 15 is Jeremiah's wrongful imprisonment. You see it says that in verse number 11, it says, and it came to pass that when the army of the Chaldeans was broken up from Jerusalem for fear of Pharaoh's army, then Jeremiah went forth out of Jerusalem to go into the land of Benjamin, to separate himself thence in the midst of the people. And when he was in the gate of Benjamin, a captain of the ward was there, whose name was Arijah, the son of Shelemiah, the son of Hananiah. And he took Jeremiah the prophet, saying, thou fallest away to the Chaldeans. In other words, you're giving up and you're going to go over to the Chaldean side. Verse 14, then said Jeremiah, it is false. I fall not away to the Chaldeans. But he hearkened not to him. They didn't listen to Jeremiah. So Arijah took Jeremiah and brought him to the princes. Wherefore the princes were wroth with Jeremiah, and smote him, and put him in prison in the house of Jonathan the scribe, for they had made that the prison. All right, so in this section we see Jeremiah's wrongful imprisonment when the siege is lifted. And you can imagine if you were stuck in a small area, confined to a small city for a period of time, and then you have the freedom to leave that city, the enemy and the danger is gone, everybody would fly out of that city. They'd go everywhere they can, run around, do whatever they can. And that's kind of what Jeremiah does. He takes this opportunity to leave the city, probably to go home, maybe to secure supplies or to secure something in his homeland. And he goes to the land of Benjamin, which was his home. In verse 12, he again leaves to take care of business that he had in the land of Benjamin. But he's accused of falling away to the Babylonians. Now, if you listen to what Jeremiah preached, that's kind of a pretty good accusation, isn't it? Because all the time he's preaching, if you fall away, if you give yourself up to the Babylonians, your life will be spared. If you stay in the city, you're going to die. But it was a false accusation nonetheless. Jeremiah protests and says, no, it is false, but he is ultimately thrown in prison. And it says that the princes were angry with him, and they smote him. And again, these princes didn't like to hear what Jeremiah had to say. The next section, look at verse number 16 and down through verse number 21. After spending many days in prison, Zedekiah comes to Jeremiah. It says, when Jeremiah, in verse 16, was entered into the dungeon, and we'll talk about what that was later, and into the cabins, and Jeremiah had remained there many days, then Zedekiah the king sent and took him out, and the king asked him secretly in his house, and said, is there any word from the Lord? And Jeremiah said, there is. For, said he, thou shalt be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon. Moreover, Jeremiah said unto King Zedekiah, what have I offended against thee, or against thy servants, or against this people, that ye have put me in prison? Where are now your prophets, which prophesied unto you, saying, the king of Babylon shall not come against you, nor against this land? That's what these false prophets had said, and that did not come to pass. Verse 20, therefore hear now, I pray thee, O Lord my king, O my Lord the king. Let my supplication, I pray thee, be accepted before thee, that thou cause me not to return to the house of Jonathan the scribe, lest I die there. Then Zedekiah the king commanded that they should commit Jeremiah into the court of the prison, and that they should give him daily a piece of bread out of the baker's street until all the bread in the city were spent. Thus Jeremiah remained in the court of the prison. All right, so the Lord again reveals his will to the king Zedekiah. After spending these many days, Zedekiah comes and says, "Is there any word from the Lord?" It's so interesting to me that he constantly wants to hear what God has to say, but he never actually does what God tells him to do. There's a major problem there. Guess what? As Jeremiah says, yep, there is a word from the Lord, and God's word didn't change from the last time. He says, you're going to be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon. You can see Zedekiah's hope, can't you? If you ask enough, maybe it'll eventually change. If I ask him, I ask him on Tuesday, and then, I didn't like what he said, maybe on Thursday it'll be different. Maybe I'll get a break, and he'll say, oh, by the way, things have changed, and, everything's going to be great for you. No, God's word did not change. God's word never changes. The same is true of our lives. God's word does not change. What he says is sin is sin. It was sin 2,000 years ago. It's sin today. What he says is righteous is righteous. What was righteous 2,000 years ago is righteous today. Now technology changes and culture changes, but God does not. And we ought to make a point that we follow his word. After this statement, Jeremiah pleads for his release. It is granted to an extent. Instead of the dungeon, which really was not a good place to be, he is now allowed in the court of the prison, a much more open and hospitable place, although it's still prison. And we see in the next section, in chapter 38, we see another lapse into that dungeon. Look what it says in verses 1 through 6. It says, Then Shephatiah the son of Mattin, and Gedaliah the son of Pashur, and Jucal the son of Shelemiah, and Pashur the son of Malchiah, heard the words that Jeremiah had spoken unto all the people, saying, Thus saith the Lord, He that remaineth in the city shall die by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence, but he that goeth forth to the Chaldeans shall live. For he shall have his life for a prey, and shall live. Thus saith the Lord, This city shall surely be given into the hand of the king of Babylon's army, which shall take it. Therefore, because Jeremiah said all these things, therefore the princes said unto the king, We beseech thee, let this man be put to death. For thus he weakeneth the hands of the men of war that remain in this city, and the hands of all the people in speaking such words unto them. For this man seeketh not the welfare of this people, but the hurt. Then Zedekiah the king said, Behold, he is in your hand, for the king is not he that can do anything against you. It's very clear in this passage that over time, as Jeremiah continues to preach, that the princes don't like hearing what he has to preach. And to be honest with you, Jeremiah does start sounding like a broken record. If you have taken time, we've only gone through a chapter and a half, and he's already said the same thing a couple of times. If you study the rest of the book, the previous chapters, he says this one statement over and over and over and over and over again. He says, if you stay in the city, you're going to die. But if you leave the city and fall away, give yourself up to the army, then you will live. And he says it a bunch of different ways. He makes it as clear as possible. He makes sure that the people understand. He's consistent in what he was preaching. But Jeremiah continues to preach and say, if you stay in the city, you will die. Now, that message does not go very far in emboldening your soldiers. If you are the captain of an army, and you had some guy who said, you know what, it's hopeless. You are all going to die. There's no chance. There's not going to be any victory. You're going to lose. The city's going to be burned. You're either going to be taken captive or die, but more than likely you're going to die. Now, if you're a soldier, and that's what you hear preached, or you hear someone saying consistently, you know, after a while, you're going to say, you know what, this is pointless. I'm out of here. And that's kind of what was happening. The princes, the leaders are hearing Jeremiah, and they're saying, this is not helping our army. This is not helping our army. And so we need to kill him. They petitioned to put Jeremiah to death. Zedekiah, the king, though in the previous chapter gave Jeremiah some liberty, now he just throws up his hands. He says, you know, princes, I can't stop you. Do what you want to Jeremiah. We often see Zedekiah, the king, vacillating, going back and forth in his decisions. And so they take Jeremiah again,